Okay, I think that's we're ready to go. So my name's Jock Given. I'm chairing the session and I'd like to welcome you all to it. Thanks very much for getting along. Sybil Nolan is going to talk to us about Jeparit Victoria, a settler-colonial mediascape. Sybil.
Thanks very much, Jock. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Dja 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 Wurrung people on land never ceded, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm researching and writing about the Wotjobaluk people and their lands and pay the same respect to them. Okay, so this paper focuses on the coverage of the Jeparit Leader from 1893 to 1902, and it's part of research I'm conducting on Jeparit and its social contexts for a larger project. Jeparit is situated in the semi-arid northwest of Victoria, north of Nil and west of Warracknabeal. Its population now is close to what it was 110 or more years ago, when it was one of those small townships on the edge of the Mallee region where white settlers struggled to establish a viable existence for themselves. At that time, Jeparit was isolated from media other than local newspapers. The Age and the Argus and the Australasian, etc., were available, of course, but they arrived at least 3 days after publication. And of course, radio didn't exist at that point. Jeparit is located on the traditional lands of the Wotjobaluk people and takes its name from their language. In framing this paper, I've used approaches from the field of settler-colonial studies to consider the contents of the Jeparit Leader. It is a particularly interesting newspaper to which to apply the settler-colonial approach, because Jeparit's great claim to fame remains Robert Menzies, the longest serving Australian Prime Minister, who was born there in 1894, had links to the Jeparit Leader, and whose family did not leave the township until he was aged in his late teens. As you may know, the history of Jeparit has often been framed through, or perhaps as, the story of Robert Menzies, but of course it is a much larger history than that. There we go. This is Tyndale's map of Aboriginal family groups of tribes at the time of settlement, of white settlement in 1788. And you can see the Wotjobaluk here in the northwestern corner of Victoria. Okay, so settler-colonial studies enables us to situate the subjectivity of Indigenous people within colonial history and to keep it in view at all times, even after the colonial moment has receded. In the Australian setting, of course, that means after federation and nationhood. This framework has guided me to keep asking during my research on Jeparit and the Jeparit Leader, where are the Aboriginal people of the Mallee in Jeparit's media history? Often their presence is hard to find in the pages of the Jeparit Leader. I'll just give you this map as well, which might be a bit more familiar, but I'll just show you here. Jeparit is located just under the Wipperfield National Park, below Lake Hindmarsh, and it's surrounded by desert country and wilderness, as you can see. During the first wave of settlement in the Mallee, skirmishes, attacks and fatal encounters were numerous in the early 1840s. And I should say that Jeparit, though it's today considered part of the Wimmera Mallee, was definitely considered part of the Mallee at the time of the region's time of discovery by whites, and in subsequent legislation in the 19th century. Richard Broome has calculated that the Aboriginal population of colonial Victoria declined by 90% by 1877, owing to disease and violence, and then later to poor nutrition, alcohol abuse, and settler indifference. The 1877 colonial census showed that 431 Aboriginal people were in the Mallee region, and that constituted about 41% of Victoria's Aboriginal population at that time. Now, only 60 of these people were living on the Ebenezer mission, a mission which had been established by Moravian fathers in 1859 at Antwerp, 60 kilometres south of Jeparit. But the majority of the Wotjobaluk people at that time worked on pastoral stations or lived off their traditional lands and waterways. But the future of the next generation of local Aboriginal people was pushed to the brink by the colonial government's decision to refuse rations to children of mixed race. And after the Moravian fathers at the mission died or departed, the Victorian government wound up the mission between 1902 and 1904. Except for a reserve around the church and cemetery, most of the mission land was sold off to farmers and graziers. Aboriginal people were formally denied access to the site after its closure, but in reality, many of them, of course, returned to visit the site or to fish in the Wimmera River nearby, which was part of their traditional activity. So even when the Jeparit Leader reported the news in 1902 that the Victorian government was likely to close the mission, the paper presented it in terms of an account of the land, much more than 1,000 acres, that would be opened up to white farmers by the ending of the mission. It wrote, quote, "The Chief Secretary has decided to close the mission station at Antwerp and remove the blacks there to Lake Conda Station. This will mean that a large tract of splendid country will in time be available for settlement." There was no consideration in the paper's coverage of whether sending those people to Lake Conda, to the Lake Conda Station was the right thing to do, or how they might fare if they were moved off their own country. And by the way, in the extensive coverage that it did give, the final report of the Board of Protectors in relation to Ebenezer mission, there was remarkable amount of detail about what buildings were on the mission site, what farming activities were carried on there, what was produced, how much food was consumed, how many sheep were given to Aboriginal people there to kill and eat each year, and so on and so forth. But there was absolutely no consideration of cultural issues. And fascinatingly, it was through reading this report, however, that I discovered that many Aborigines had played sport for Jeparit. So Aborigines of mixed race had actually often supported themselves, if they were good cricketers or footballers, by playing for the local football and cricket teams. And for this representation, people in Jeparit had provided them with food and other needs. But of course, this wasn't actually recognisable to me as a researcher reading the newspaper, because these people had Christian names and they had the common surnames of settlers from around the area. So had I not read that report, I wouldn't have realised that fact about these Aboriginal people. So the field of settler-colonial studies fiercely reminds us that Aboriginal people remain in the story of white occupation, though often their stories are yet to be recovered and told. In settler colonialism, the coloniser never departs. It's not like Hong Kong, where the British pack up one day and leave. In settler colonialism in Australia, New Zealand, and North America, the coloniser never departs, and this creates ongoing tension, Indigenous resistance, and white denial. In the Mallee, the Wotjobaluk do not conveniently disappear, no matter the extent to which the colonial and post-colonial authorities write them out of the picture, for example, through the official ban on Aboriginal people returning to Ebenezer mission. However, there is something of a good ending to that story, in the sense that a century after their eviction from Ebenezer, some of their claims to their traditional lands and waterways were recognised in 2005 in an historic agreement which gives local people there the rights to hunt, fish, gather and camp in a very large block of northwestern Victoria. So to return to the story of the Jeparit Leader and its coverage, with Eloise Faichney providing research assistance to me, and I've got to say I couldn't have done this research without her, I've conducted a fairly conventional content analysis of the Jeparit Leader between 1893 and 1902, scanning the papers closely for coverage about Jeparit related to its development and basically to anything that was going on in the local environment that is significant. I should say that good old COVID stopped us from digging deeply into 3 years in this survey, which was 1899 to 1901. We were only able to briefly sample before the State Library had to ask us to leave. And unfortunately, there are no other copies available online of the Jeparit Leader. So we'll be back there as soon as we're allowed to be. But we were able to sample enough. As we read the paper, I could see how the Jeparit Leader, entering the scene in 1893 at the embryonic stage of Jeparit's life as a settlement, captured almost the entire development of its necessary civic institutions, the gradual and often hard-won arrival of vital transport and communication infrastructure, a proper post office, a telegraph office, the extension of the passenger and freight train service from Dimboola, which wasn't completed until 1894, then the further extension of that line, the building of a bridge over the Wimmera to connect isolated townships to Jeparit's stores and services. It was such a small community that its fathers, if I can put it that way, knew that if they did not have these links, they would not be able to survive just by the number of people who needed their services and their commodities in the Jeparit region. There was also the political battle that went on subterraneously over closer settlement law. As a new generation of farmers moved into the district and took up lots that had been carved out of established pastoral holdings, the resulting tensions between these two groups were fought out between members of the Dimboola Shire Council, for example, or in public meetings called to discuss the need for sanitation arrangements or dedicated water supply, etc. For almost a decade, the town had no public meeting place except the Mechanics Institute Hall. And this modest timber building, unlined inside and built without a source of heating, was a constant source of financial worry to the town. As the Victorian economy plunged into economic depression just as the hall was built, there was £180 still to pay, remaining to be paid on it. And it also contained a library that was small and very costly to improve. And the hall's piano was also being purchased on time payment. So this was something that the people of Jeparit were always trying to raise funds to finish paying for the hall. The Jeparit Leader was owned and operated until 1899 by Sydney Sampson, who was Robert Menzies' uncle by marriage. In July 1894, Sampson was one of a group who called a meeting at the Mechanics Institute to propose setting up a minstrel club to raise money for the hall. This is perhaps not as extraordinary as it sounds to us now. Blackface minstrel shows were still popular in the US and London, in Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere. Amateur minstrel entertainments were often staged as fundraisers for local causes. In 1896, the governor of Victoria and his wife, Lady Brassey, were guests of honour at a blackface minstrel show staged at Geelong by an amateur minstrel troupe that raised £66 for the hospital there. As the Jeparit Leader itself noted, minstrel entertainments were, quote, usually highly attractive in country districts. The Jeparit meeting, noting that minstrel entertainments formerly held in the district had realised as much as £11 for good causes, decided now that it was worth reviving the practice and formed a club to do so. And on November the 7th of 1894, the group announced its first entertainment, promising, quote, a program that had never been equalled in any country town. This ad is interesting. It's in the Leader, of course, and it talks about the Theatre Royal Jeparit, but there was no such place, of course. This is part of the fantasy that's been created around the minstrel entertainment here. So this would be the first of a number of entertainments that it held at the Mechanics Hall that raised quite a lot of money every year to help pay off the hall. These appearances were always in aid of good causes. And Helen English's scholarship shows how this was generally the case. The amateur nature of the entertainments was rendered respectable by community fundraising. Importantly, it's not stated in any of the reports of Jeparit Minstrel Club programs whether the performance was, whether the players appeared in blackface. But the concerts certainly followed the convention of American minstrelsy, with key figures such as the interlocutor and two low comics, Tambo, the tambourine player, and Bones, playing the bones or castanets. And if I can just show you this picture really quickly, this is the Plantation dance band. This came from the collection of the Wimmera Mallee Pioneer Museum. Just wanted to point out to you the tambourines and bones are located in front of the bass drum in this picture. I haven't been able to match the Plantation dance band yet to the newspaper, but the implication is clear that they performed in Jeparit at some point. So in the case of the first concert that was put on by the Jeparit Minstrel Club, the program opened with the mock spiritual called Who's Dat Callin' So Sweet? The entertainment also featured farces as part of the program, which was very much in line with American blackface programs. One of them concerned a couple of doctors' boys, as they were described, who were left to fend for the patients by themselves, with amusing but very upsetting results. The review of the program, run by the Jeparit Leader, referred to these characters as Ethiopians, a term that was usually used in relation to British blackface performances. The club's performances were popular in Jeparit. They mixed plantation elements with British versions of blackface, and they reflected the nostalgic view of the plantation Negro, gentle, doltish, and bound by ties of obedience and affection to massa. And that sort of characterisation there is by a scholar of Australian blackface called Richard Waterhouse. I guess the problem, of course, for us is that we don't know what Aboriginal people in the area thought of this. There is nothing to tell us what they made of what was supposedly just good fun and respectable fundraising. And if I can go on to show you how absolutely poignant and pregnant this silence in the history is, I'll show you this notice that also appeared in the Jeparit Leader in 1897, advertising a similar concert, a similar minstrel entertainment in Rainbow, the next town up the road, by, as you can see there, the Rainbow Aboriginals. Now, it's impossible to know whether this actually was an Aboriginal group or not, but I very strongly suspect it was not, because firstly, it would seem to be unusual, but secondly, the Jeparit Leader later had to explain that the, quote, Aboriginals had native talent, and it was therefore bound to be a very good show. I found this really disturbing when I found this notice. And for me, as I say, it actually spoke to the silence that exists in Jeparit and district's history about attitudes towards blackface generally and towards people of colour, including the local Aboriginal people. There have been some arguments made by scholars that Australian blackface harked back to older times and to carnivalesque traditions of otherness, which included depictions through blackface of Irishness and Jewishness and in American Indians, etc. But it's no doubt that the American antebellum tradition was a central blackface tradition referenced in the Jeparit shows, as reports of the concerts invariably mention Tambo and Bones. Blair's comment in an article on Canadian and Australian blackface tradition notes that you can see the geographical reach of the form and its popularity because it was found in India, Jamaica, Nigeria, and South Africa. And basically, Blair argued that this showed that blackface, quote, validated racism at home and Western imperialism around the world. And so to find it as a representation of colour in the Jeparit Leader, side by side with the very large silences about the actual lives and culture of the local Aboriginal people, is quite disturbing to me. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sybil. That's great. Questions? Anyone? Perhaps I'll ask her first. You showed an image from a local pioneer museum, and you've talked about the silence about Aboriginal people in the newspaper. Is the silence also invisibility in photographs?
Sorry, can you just...
those photographic collections, to the extent that they exist in Jeparit or elsewhere, are Aboriginal people not present?
Yes, the museum there is called the Mallee Pioneer Museum, and reflecting on it, as I have over the last few weeks quite a lot, yes, there's not a lot of material about Aboriginal people there at all. And some of the most interesting photos in their collection, I think, are the photos of Indian hawkers, who are very common in the area around Federation. And there's a very poignant photo, which if I'd had time today, I would have showed you, of a group of very, striking, well-presented Indian men on the side of the Hopetown House Hotel before it was built in central Jeparit, making a breakfast for themselves or making a meal for themselves on a little fry pan on a fire. And when you look at the picture, on the ground next to the guy who's doing the cooking are 6 eggs just delicately placed in the dirt, waiting to be picked up and cooked in the pan. It's a very striking image. The more I look at it, the more I took from it. Mm. But that's unusual. There's nothing that's equivalent in terms of Aboriginal people.
Thanks, Sybil. Matthew, is that a question?
And I was just nodding, as in nodding at what she was answering. But yeah.
If there are not other questions, maybe a second from me, Sybil. I'm interested in the time frame of white settlement in the area. James Boyce talks of the speed with which white graziers moved through Victoria and then up into Western New South Wales and Western Victoria from 1835. And I'm interested in the time frame here.
Yeah.
Did white people come through and bring flocks through rapidly, or was it slow?
Look, it was slower because, look, really, as you know, the Mallee was just totally impenetrable in many ways. It was rather like Gippsland in that way. But overlanders came from New South Wales to Adelaide with sheep, I think, in 1835. No, yeah, I think that's right. And then settlement followed in the very early 1840s. And once it started to pick up pace quite quickly. And the area, even to the west of Lake Hindmarsh, which is really like, that's the big desert, really, that was all settled quite relatively quickly. But the great factor, which I hadn't really thought through, and still thank you, Amanda. The great factor, which I hadn't really thought of until I read more of the local history, was that it was the gold rushes that brought a whole stream of people through that district from Adelaide. And of course, I should have realised that. But yes, from then on, it started to really open up after the 1850s.
So it was not gold in that area, but people...
No, people on the way. They came through they skirted around the little desert and went north of Horsham and then up towards the goldfields. And, so at that point, I mean, it's a really quite surprisingly ethnically diverse population in some ways, because you've got Chinese people come through there, and many of them actually stay and become market gardeners or traders, and labourers, so they're often treated respectfully in press reports. And there's also the Indian hawkers and a range of other people around the area. But of course, predominantly, it's a very white culture of settlers.
Sybil, can I just, knowing obviously of your interest in Robert Menzies and his life and work and so on, and you mentioned him and his uncle earlier in your presentation. Anything from that side of the fence, so to speak, from their family, are the First Nations people in the area just completely invisible to them, like they were to the newspaper, or not?
It's a very interesting question. I'm aware, because I've read James Menzies' comments James Menzies later became state MP, MLA, and he made a number of speeches in the Victorian Parliament where he actually raised the plight of the dispossessed Aboriginal people who'd been pushed off the mission and were now camped by the Wimmera River, very close to the township of Jeparit. The river runs just by the town, and he was very sympathetic to them, and he was genuinely asking for help. And he also, I've read in work by Jane Lydon, that he actually would talk to Aboriginal people when he met them at the annual agricultural show. And he did care about them. But having said that, it's one of those classic contradictions that in 1902, James Menzies was actually the president of the Dimboola Shire, which was the local shire in which the mission was located and Jeparit was located. And of course, that was the era of the Kyabram movement, the movement for reform, for reduction of expenditure by the government on a massive scale. And so there's a rather mysterious or mystifying comment by the Jeparit leader at the start of the report of 1902 about that the mission's going to close, probably going to close. And it says, this will be of interest to people who've been following what the Dimboola Shire has decided and been saying about events recently. And I'm going, what are they talking about? I can't find anything in the paper about what they've said. And then eventually I realized they must be talking about the Kyabram movement, which James Menzies had actually identified the Shire with. James Menzies went off to Melbourne to work for the Kyabram movement at that point. He didn't stay there for long. He came back, but in the meantime, he'd given up the presidency of the Shire he regained it later. But, you know, it was, so I can only assume that, and this is so James Menzies-ish, you know, he very much cared about making ends meet. He really cared about budgets. He was often the treasurer or the auditor or whatever for the hall's accounts. And so, yes, he cared about reducing expenditure at a time where Victoria had been in this, you know, really long depression. And I'm sure he would have actually supported reducing the costs. They pointed out that there were 8 missions in Victoria, and I can't remember, it was a large sum of money that they were costing to run. And basically there was this argument going on, some also in the pages of the Jeparit Leader, about, you know, it was too much money. Basically, it was said to be too much money for the, you know, the small number of Aboriginal people remaining in Victoria at that time. So, yeah, I think yes and no is the answer to that, Matthew.
Thanks, Sybil.
Answer. Thank you for asking the question.
Any other questions at all?
I can see some more comments.
Or maybe just finally, and then we'll wrap up because we're slightly over time, Sybil. Is there any, given that Robert Menzies himself was, if he's born 1894, the mission closed 1902 to 1904, you said, do we know, either you or others on the call, is there any record, did he ever refer to that? I mean, one would imagine in a small town that would be quite a significant event, even for a 10-year-old.
Yeah. He did actually refer to the people of the mission. And I mean, you know, Judith Brett, Troy Bramston and others have written about this, and I'll certainly mention it again myself in the future, that he gave an interview in 1967 in which he referred to the fact they were good football players. So I think it was actually on his mind. He was asked about the Aboriginals in the area around Jeparit. Were there any, and what were they like, and were they seen much and stuff? And he mentioned that they were great footballers, which obviously ties in with the fact that they were playing for Jeparit. But then he went on to say they were idle, and they only cared about their families. What a shock, you know, they only cared about that, spending time with their communities and stuff like that. So he was very, very dismissive of them. But, you know, look, I think at this stage, I would never make excuses for Robert Menzies in relation to this stuff, I've got to say, actually. But that late in life, I think he was certainly suffering problems caused by strokes and things. So I think it's worth remembering. But, you know, he was not very sympathetic to Aboriginal people. He was not like his father, who was a Methodist, you know, through and through.
That's great, Sybil. Thanks very much. Really interesting presentation. Really appreciate that. For everyone, I think we're at the end of the day, so we'll look forward to seeing you in other sessions tomorrow. Thanks, Josh, for your assistance from VU.